A warm welcome to everybody. I am Renato Moro. I am the president of Civitas, and I wish to welcome all the participants to this first webinar of series. This first event is devoted to an online table on historiography in Christian democracy. Of course, I welcome both the people coming from Civitas community and newcomers. The first duty is to thank the colleagues who have accepted to participate in this round table and that will discuss together with us the historical research on Christian democracy. You may see them on the screen. I give my thanks to Professor Massimo de Giuseppe, then to Professor Gerd Rainer Horn, then to Professor Hans-Jürgen Kusters, then to Professor Slavomir Lukasiewicz, and last but not least to Professor Michael Gehler, who was able to participate only recently. So we have warmly added him to the panel. Of course, there is no necessity to introduce the speakers. Many of them are surely well known to everybody. I will give some short information about them one by one while they will begin to speak. I want only to add some preliminary words about our activity, especially for those who do not know us. Civitas is a network of institutions and archives, of research institutions and archives, but also a network open to individual researchers and individual archivists. We focus on Christian democracy, both at the national level and at the European, at the worldwide level. We mainly work on Christian democracy in the 20th century and especially in the second half of the 20th century, but we include also the precedents of Christian democracy in our analysis. So the second half of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, the pre-war period. And of course, we do not forget actual developments. We work on Christian democracy in a broader sense. That is, of course, we analyze the Christian democratic parties, of course, but we also refer, as it is evident, I think, to Christian social movements, trade unions, religious groups, etc. Our aim is mainly to encourage all initiatives in this area and bring together interested researchers in their institutions and joint projects. Civitas has 3 founding members and 3 associated ones. The founding full members are the Documentation and Research Center on Religion, Culture and Society of Leuven, KADOC, then the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, once in Bonn, now in Berlin, I think, then the Istituto Luigi Sturzo in Rome. The associated members are the Archivio per la Storia del Movimento Sociale Cattolico in Italia Mauro Romani, the Archive for the History of the Catholic Social Movement in Italy, the Catholic Documentation Center in Nijmegen, and the Carl von Vogelstang Institute for the research on the history of Christian democracy in Austria, that is in Vienna. In our scientific committee, there are many authoritative scholars in Christian democracy. Some of them you see here, Professor Kusters, who is also our honorary president, Professor Gehler, but also Professor Guido Formigoni, Professor Wolfgang Kaiser, Professors Hans Krabendam, Professors Ann Kusters, Professor Scrim Christians, Professor Andrea Maria Locatelli, Professor Michael Bochard, Professor Stephen van Heke, Professor Helmut Vonhout. The main activity Civitas has developed in the recent years has been the promotion of annual conferences. Precisely in these days, if the COVID-19 pandemic would not have obliged us to change our plans, we would have gathered in Leuven for the new annual conference that would have been devoted to the new social movements of the 1970s and their view of Christian democracy. And in next October, I hope, we will do this if the pandemic situation will be the one everybody hopes to. And in the last years, we have analyzed in our annual conferences many new fields of research about Christian democracy. I may mention some of this. The last annual conference in Nijmegen was devoted to Christian democratic people's parties and the rise of populism. But we have also researched on Christian democracy in exile, or Christian democracy in labor, or the role of Christian democracy in the opening of the Iron Curtain, or Christian democracy and women, and many other issues. Second main activity Civitas has started to develop is a series of books. The series is titled Studies in Christian Democracy. It is in collaboration with Leuven University Press, and the aim of the series is to follow the higher academic international respected standard. We have just published in last year, at the end of 2019, the first volume of the series. Professor Gehler was one of the editors of this, together with Professors Kosicki and Vonhout, and the book, I may show it to us, may you see it. This is, was devoted to Christian democracy and the fall of communism. And we hope to follow this with the next one. We are working on it. Probably it will be devoted to Christian democracy in exile. There is a third field of activity of Civitas, and it is the topic of tomorrow. It is this our tomorrow web seminar. That is the Academy for Young Scholars. Already in the past, we have promoted doctoral seminars in our annual conference. Recently, we have decided to start a further initiative that is to stimulate fresh interdisciplinary approaches and themes on Christian democracy, of course, welcoming young scholars and researchers, not only with the presentations and discussion of their research projects, and not only with the contribution of lecturer and keynote speakers, but also when a direct access to sources and archival materials that is hosted in our research and archive institutions. So this is the reason why we decided to gather ourselves online in order in some way to replace our annual conference. And so we will have this roundtable for today, and tomorrow at the same time, a presentation of the Research Academy with the keynote speech by Professor Piotr Krosicki on why study Christian democracy. I think that's enough. It's time to begin our debate, give floor to the speakers. So a few words on this roundtable at its goal. We aim to discuss the general situation of historical research on Christian democracy today, its main results, its eventual limits, and to discover through the contribution of the speakers the new research paths that is possible to envisage and to support today. I imagine a first intervention of around 10 minutes from the speakers, and after this first round of intervention, I will give some personal reaction very shortly and suggest my point of view on the actual situation of studies. Then a second shorter round will follow, 5 minutes, I imagine, devoted to an interaction between all the speakers. Then we will open the floor to the audience for further contribution. We will follow the order that is indicated in the program. So the first speaker will be Professor Massimo De Giuseppe. Professor Massimo De Giuseppe is Associate Professor of Contemporary History at the IULM University in Milan. His main field of research has been international history and the history of religious, social movements, and in particular, he has studied the relationship between Europe and Latin America, international cooperation, peace movements, third world groups, and human rights. Among his many books, I have to mention the books he have devoted to Mexican Revolution, to Italian Catholics and Latin America, and to one of the more interesting leaders in Italian Christian democracy, that was the personality of Giorgio La Pira, the mayor of the city of Florence. So the floor is up to Massimo De Giuseppe.
Thank you very much, Professor Moro. Thank you to the organizers of this really interesting conference, and it's my first presence in the Civitas group, so I'm very happy to be here. I prepared a longer version than 10 minutes, so I have to reduce in a very radical way my speech. It's really interesting, I think, to analyze in this end of 2020 the trend of historiography on Latin American Christian democracies. Also because for some years we have been witnessing a rather peculiar, I could say, political process in Latin America. The growing marginalization of Christian democratic parties in the political balance, even in those countries where the phenomenon had been so relevant, like Chile or Venezuela. In face of a growing advance of the evangelical electorate from Guatemala, where the decisive election of the comedian Jimmy Morales in 2016, to Brazil of Jair Bolsonaro. And that's interesting because the neo-Pentecostal evangelical world that tries not to assume the traditional party form, as we know for the democratic Christian experience, moves according to the logic of American lobbying. In many ways, obtaining political weight often higher than the percentage of the faithful on the total population. A process that has roots in the past, as the historian of Latin American Protestantism, I think, for example, to Jean-Pierre Bastien, as well written, but which has found a new dimension starting from the new Cold War season of the 80s, as reconstructed very well in different terms by Greg Grandin for Guatemalan Experience, René de la Torre in a Latin American view with her Atlas of Religious Diversity, or the studies of Reframes, EILA, networks, and very recently the project coordinated by Roberto Blancarte of Colegio de México for the Fondo de Cultura Económica, Diccionario de las Religiones en América Latina, who has a work that has a very interesting part dedicated to the idea of democratic Christian party. And the advancement of the neoliberal thesis of the 90s, deeply affecting through the theology of prosperity, both the selection of the ruling classes and social policies. So we are in a very delicate and important turning point for the history and the historiography of Christian democracy in the region of Latin America. And I believe this element is useful for understanding how the conception of Christian democracy as a fundamentally 20th century experience, first as a widespread movement, then in the party form, that develop in differently forms in the various phases of the century, as today reach a decisive turning point for its same survival, as indirectly recalled by Pope Francis during some of his speeches during, I think especially during the meeting with the movements in Ecuador in 2015 and also in the Peruvian Amazon in 2018. Speeches in which it directly touched the elements of the presence of a political Christian party in the wide scene of Latin American transformations. However, the ability to place the analysis in a long-term process, which takes into account a series of historical specificities from the heritage of the old history of Latin America, remains a fundamental element for understanding the history and consequently the historiography of Latin American democratic Christian movement. I think I totally agree with the presentation of Professor Moro, because we can't understand the history and historiography of democratic Christian party in Latin American without a longue durée vision, without the idea of the movements of the first part of the century, the impact of Rerum Novarum in all Latin America, the process of Romanization initiated by the Holy See after the Latin American Plenary Council of 1899, and other different impacts that come in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, for example, with the Eucharistical Congresses, or the impact of Medellin, obviously, with the Opción por los Pobres, the Puebla Compromise, and all these transformations that across all the Pope's experiences in their relation with Latin America. We need to put a lot of attention to this dimension of the long journey of history about the genesis, the development, and the crisis of Latin American Christian democratic parties. Because returning specifically to the historiography of democratic Christian, 40 years after the exploratory survey of the presence of Christian democracy in Latin America carried out by German politician Peter Molk, in 2010, an articulated book published in English and Spanish, edited by Scottman Reining and Timothy Scully, has turned into what is perhaps the most ambitious attempt today to draw a comparative picture of party Catholic experiences of Christian democracy, but not only in the subcontinent. The book tried to compare with a wealth of sources, documents, and interpretative analysis a series of emblematic but not necessarily linear national cases from Mexico to Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica in the north-central part of the continent, and Peru, Venezuela, and Chile for the southern part. It was an interesting book, very innovative in some way, with some very good chapters, I think, especially of the Soledad Loaesa about Mexican experience, or the Ignacio Walker about the Chilean experience that were really interesting, also the Kirk Hawkins. But on the other side, I think that the relation of the book with the national experiences, the idea of populism, the processes of democratization, as something that leaves a lot to do for our research. The book, as a comparative approach, represents an important historiographical piece with respect to field of research, but I have some different ideas about the periodization with this book, and also with another recent book work that take this international model with a different approach, that is the recent book of Carlo Invernizzi Accetti, What is Christian Democracy, Politics, Religion, and Ideology, from the Cambridge University Press, that at a conceptual and perspective level is really interesting. The study is certainly very rich, articulated. The chapter 9 dedicated to Latin America inside a more wide open analysis of the democratic Christian processes, titled Ideology, Christian Democracy in the Americas, Periphery of Vanguards, offers a very interesting analysis. There is an ideologist trajectory that it's really interesting. There is a new interpretation of the pioneering studies of Roberto Papini, l'Internazionale Democristiana, cooperazione tra i partiti cristiano-democratici dal 1925 al 1985. But I think again there is a sort of scheme, a sort of a cage of periodization that I can't rely at all. The idea is that all the processes, like in other books, I think, for example, the books of Gianni Labella about the return of Rome in Latin America during the 30s, starts this history with the processes of the 20s and the 30s. And in many ways, it's true, because we are in the season of the Eucharistical Congresses, we are in the season of the redefinition of Catholic action in many Latin American countries, we are in the season when Catholic parties started, like, for example, Partido de Acción Nacional in 39 in Mexico, or the La Falange in Chile, that are the ancestors, in this case, of the Democratic Christian Party of Chile. But I think that this kind of periodization, that then I can agree with the development of the periodization, the transformation of the 30s, the big transformation of the 50s, the entrance and the impact of the Alliance of Progress, obviously, that is something that is really well studied in recent years from American and European historians, many ways coming from international relation more than from contemporary history. And then the 70s, the crisis, the impact of the big dictatorship of South America until the Washington Consensus of the 80s and the neoliberalism of the 90s. I can agree with this kind of periodization, but I don't think that the 20s and the 30s were the real starting. I think that we have to return a little bit back in the first part, in what I define the impact, the real impact of Rerum Novarum in Latin America, because that is a season, the season between the last year of 19th century and the first 15 years of 20th century that coincide in part with the starting of Mexican Revolution, in which we can experience a real change in the definition between state institution, the church, the local church, and the Holy See, the vision of the Holy See, of the organization of the laity, the policy, the social movements, the schools, the education of the masses on one side and the education of the leadership on the other side, and obviously the presence of the Catholics in the social and then in the politics arenas. It's very interesting, for example, for me, the insert of the experience of Partido Católico Nacional Mexicano. That was a very primordial experience related to the first phase of the Mexican Revolution and related with a big issue that in many studies about Latin American democratic Christian is forgetting, the heritage of the dualism of 19th century between conservatives and liberals. That means also a relation with Europe and United States. That's something apparently old, but I'm sure that this is something that remains in the ADN, in the formation of the first group that then will transform themselves in Democratic Christian Party during the 30s. So I think that it's impossible to understand the revolution of the 30s without a serious analysis of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. I think that historiography speaking, we have a lot of studies in Mexico and Argentina. I think of Diego Mauro, Miranda Lida, Alvaro Matute, Jean Meyer, and many others that have studied this part of the formation of democratic Christian movements. And we have not so many, but now a good amount of studies about democratic Christian parties on a national level. For example, we have many studies and many archives now and many documents about the Chilean case. We have many studies about the Mexican case. I have to say about the Mexican case that I don't think, maybe I'm against the thesis of Invernizzi, but I don't think that Partido de Acción Nacional, PAN, is a Christian democratic party. I think it's outside of the idea of vision. It's more a conservative party. If we have studied rather well the documentation of the founders of the party, González Luna and Efraín González Luna, Morfin, and the vision is a totally different vision, is a totally big distance with respect of the Catholic Action Project, with respect of the Episcopate, respect of the Holy See Project, and it's more a conservative return in a complex relation that the Catholics and the conservative has with Mexican post-revolutionary states. But I don't think that PAN can be considered a democratic Christian party. On the other side, the classical prototype, COPEI, with this very specific characteristic in the Venezuelan case, with the strong personalities of Rafael Caldera and a lot of studies about this, I think Levine studies and many others, or the Chilean Democratic Christian Party with so strong presence of Eduardo Frei Montalva, and a lot of studies about it, starting from the studies of a member of the party like Patricio Alwin, whose archive now is a very important research for the investigation, have a totally different perspective. I would also enter in another question, the relation between the historiography, the national historiography of Democratic Christian Party and the internationalist vision of this kind of studies. For example, in the last year, we have seen various books that tries to speak about the international dimension. I think to stay in Italy, the book of Raffaele Nocera, Il Sogno Infranto, that it's about la Unión Mundial Democrata Cristiana, that is based fundamentally on the Mariano Rumor archive, and should be put in contact with other resources and archives. But it's an interesting approach. It's really important, like the book of Manwaring and Scully that I quoted before. But I think that this kind of books need to dialogue with a more complex vision of Cold War in Latin America, of studies about Alliance for Progress, of studies about the specific impact in the national cases of the transformation of the changes of between the 50s and the 60s. Another argument, as many cases I've seen is not so considered, is the very important impact of the good neighborhood policy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I think, was really important to change the approach to United States with respect to Latin American countries and Latin American parties. And his policy opened new ways that can be recovered from Kennedy Alliance for Progress, and can be recovered in some experience like the Human Rights Project of Jimmy Carter during the 70s, but with a very complex, wide range of actors in the specific country. I try to express better myself. I've studied very well the Salvadorian case. In the case of El Salvador, where you find a typical Democratic Christian Party, very well studied, for example, from Lindo Fuentes or Eric Ching, that started in the 60s during the Alliance for Progress, started in a new context, in a scenario that is trying to introduce democratization processes in a country that was dominated from the 30s from military regime. It produced a very complex presence of factors. You have the party, and you have a lot of fractures inside the party. For example, the fracture that is produced after 72 and the coup d'etat against José Napoleón Duarte, the recovery of Napoleón Duarte to the American cause and his return in a different shape in El Salvador in the second half of the 70s. The fracture with the young people coming from the Catholic Action, like Marianela Garcia Villas, the future director of the Human Rights Commission of the Archbishop Romero, then killed in '83. The fracture with trade unions, for example, Catholic trade unions like FECAS, that are very strictly linked with some Jesuit priests like Father Rutilio Grande or Father Ellacuria, that are moving outside of the vision that the Democratic Christian Party was maintaining during the 70s. So what I'm trying to say is that if you try to analyze a single case, and we step, for example, in Central America, when the Democratic Christian Party of El Salvador is completely different from the Guatemaltecan Democratic Christian Party, or the Honduras one, or the Costa Rican, etc., etc. We can find that the party is a very complex creature. very different from an European democratic Christian party. And inside this complexity, you have a lot of fluidity that sometimes the historiography can't catch up very well. You have people that enter and exit the party rather quickly. You have people that go outside of the party, formed in Catholic Action, that enter in a military revolutionary group like Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo. And this fluidity is part of generally of Central American scenario with specific characteristics for every country, but is also a common ground for many Latin American experience, especially in Mexico, Central American, also in the COPEI experience of Venezuela, not so much in Chile, that it's a more organized and structured organization for the party, and for other experiences of Christian Democratic Party like Bolivian one, that it's also another really interesting that it's not so analyzed from historiography. To close my short speech, two last references. The first one is about Argentina. Argentina is usually out of the radar of the Christian Democratic Party because of the peculiarity of Peronism and the peculiarity of the relation between Peronism and the church, Peronism and the mass society, etc., etc. But I think that in some way is more Christian democratic, some elements and structure of Peronism than Mexican PAN. That's a little sort of radical interpretation could be considered, but I'm rather convinced about it. And the other element is about the news of the open of the Vatican archive for the Pope Pio XII that now we are experimenting. The old secret Vatican archive that Pope Francis transformed in apostolic archive with a more polite definition. I think that will be very interesting to redefine the genesis and the transformation of the democratic Christian movements in democratic Christian organized party. It will be very useful for historiography, and I think that it will be very useful not only through the Secretary of State's documents, the apostolic delegation documents, but if we'll be able to analyze the visit ad limina, this kind of documents that usually are more concerned to the deep presence of the people in the life of the church, but that can teach us a lot of things about the real concrete construction of the project and the connection between Catholic Action Movement, university movements, and the creation of Falange in Chile and of other experience. Last but not least, we can say, for example, for the last part of Pio XI about the Sinarquista movement that was a very radical right-wing movement that crossed Mexico, but with a very transnational attitude, like Julia Young wrote very, very cleverly, that the borders between laity, clerical actors and social movements were very, very fluent, like the possibility to enter in an organized party. So we have to consider these elements in a new perspective, I think, of the historiography of Democratic Christian Party about Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor De Giuseppe. I am very happy that this roundtable began with Latin America. For three reasons on which I would like to come back after. Necessity of a worldwide perspective while studying Christian democracy first. Second, the problem of political identity what kind of deep political identity Christian democratic parties have. Third, interconnection between national and international perspective, that is the problem of comparative approaches while studying Christian democracy. I limit myself only to this kind of slogans, then I will try to go more in depth in this kind of issues that I think are central for today's analysis on Christian democracy. So thank you very much. Now the floor is for Professor Gerd Reinerhorn, who is full professor in political history at Sciences Po Paris. We know him very well for his studies on social movements, especially on leftist social movements, and in particular on leftist Catholicism. His book on the spirit of '68 has been a mandatory reading for many of us. More recently, he has published on liberation theology, on the Vatican II Council, and in general on progressive Catholicism. His last book, that is very recently has been published, is about 1943-1948. It is the moment of liberation in Western Europe. So thank you, Professor Horn. The floor is to you now.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Unfortunately, it's not an invitation to Rome in real life, but okay, you know, Zoom is always an alternative. But as I warned Professor Moro, you know, I want to say primarily a few words about some recent trends in historical research on Catholic sociabilities and Catholic social movements in the late 1960s and 1970s, not so much addressing straightforwardly the history of Christian democracy, although I will come to it towards the end of my 10 minutes. So, as you mentioned, I have attempted to make my own contribution to this topic in the past years. And I'm very happy to note that younger scholars have picked up this theme and carried out excellent work on this topic. Not all of it yet published, so watch this space. My own specialty, as Professor Moro mentioned, is a transnational approach to such topics, though I have limited myself for the most part to continental Western Europe, which is okay on one sense large enough, but it's only Europe. Now there are several younger scholars who are likewise interested in a transnational approach. One of them I want to mention is Guido Panvini, now at the University of Bologna, who spent 2 years as a Marie Curie Fellow at Sciences Po, carrying out archival work in pursuit of his project, which is entitled something like Young Catholic Workers' Movements in Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, mostly in the 1960s and early 70s. Marta Busani, who published a few years ago what I consider to be by far the best study of Gioventù Studentesca, will hopefully step into the footsteps of Panvini and obtain a Marie Curie Fellowship at Sciences Po in the current round of applications to study the inner life, public activities, and interactions by the most relevant international associations of specialized Catholic action, the Jeunesse Étudiante Catholique Internationale, the Jeunesse Ouvrière Catholique Internationale and the Mouvement International de la Jeunesse Agricole et Rurale Catholique. And I refer to these associations by the French term because this seems to be, well, certainly back then it was the lingua franca, French, for most of these movements. I should add, perhaps as an encouragement for other young researchers, that for such studies, there are great and largely untapped resources out there, waiting to be visited and mined by talented young scholars. Just want to mention one, the archive of the International Association of Young Catholic Workers, the JOC International, for instance, remains to this day a fantastic resource, but only visited by less than a handful of scholars each year. It is located in Brussels, which Etienne Fouillou once termed the International Planetary Center of Specialized Catholic Action. And the archive was organized by Marguerite Fievé, the longtime personal secretary of Joseph Cardin. And that archive is better organized than many professional archives, and Brussels is a dynamic city which true aficionados of European urban culture sometimes rank higher than Paris as a place to live and to work, at least for a few weeks. And of course, near Brussels is Leuven, home of the CADOC, already mentioned by Professor Morrow, which has provided for some time space and the resources to be exploited by researchers interested in Catholic sociabilities, above all in Belgium, yes, but not only in Belgium. And a few years ago, I played a minor role in stimulating or helping to stimulate the organization of an international conference on the connections between European left Catholicism and Latin American liberation theology. And the published volume emerging from this landmark event should see the light of day relatively soon, I hope. For the concrete and mutually beneficial connections between Latin American and European progressive Catholicism remains to this day largely shrouded in obscurity and mystery. Latin American scholars often disregard the European contributions to the development of liberation theology and associated movements. Europeans often, by no means always, often tend to either focus on their own little continent, as I do, or they become enamored with an exotic foreign location and forget the forest for all the trees. So the bulk of cutting-edge research on Catholic social movements in the long 60s continues to concentrate on one national context only. And I wish in no way to minimize, let alone denigrate, such direly needed work. Without the work of historians and other social scientists who concentrate on one country or one region or one town only, transnational and or comparative historians would be lost in space. And the list of topics, of projects, and of publications on one specific national territory is far too long to be evoked in these brief comments. I really only wish to highlight one monograph published in German in 2017. I jumped to Latin America to introduce this one. Within Latin America, Chile has frequently been a prominent hotspot for secular social movements in the long 60s, for obvious reasons. But religious social movements in Chile did not lag far behind. To the contrary, for instance, Christians for Socialism became a comet-like grouping in the early to mid-1970s in Latin America and then in Europe. And it all began in the late 1960s in Chile. Until today, in fact, there exists still no transnational study of Christians for Socialism whose fame and influence rose very rapidly in the early 1970s, only to vanish and disappear in an equally rapid manner by the mid-1970s and in subsequent years. The fate of Christians for Socialism was intimately linked with a second wave of worker priests in Latin America, in Europe, and elsewhere. But Christians for Socialism was more than a mere movement of worker priests, much more. A spin-off, or many spin-off organizations emerged and grew like mushrooms in the rain. Another group which I had, one of those spin-off organizations, let's put it this way, which I had the great fortune to encounter in its later stages, was a dynamic organization founded by European and Latin American radical Catholics, first in Chile, and which, after the brutal crushing of the experiment of Salvador Allende's popular unity government, spread quite literally throughout the world. By the time I met some of these guiding spirits of this project in Germany about 15 years ago, they were known as by the somewhat prosaic name of Projektgruppe Industriearbeit, by then pretty much concentrated on missionary work in the metalworking and chemical factories of the Mannheim-Ludwigshafen industrial agglomeration on both sides of the Rhine. Martin Janik is the author of an excellent monograph on this community of believers and activists. The title of his study is Die Utopie eines radikalen Ortswechsels in der Kirche. Now, how did all this affect, or how has all this affected Christian democratic milieus and Christian democratic parties in particular? The link between Christian democracy in the long 60s and left or progressive Catholicism is not necessarily self-evident, and don't worry that I will be able to give you a long disquisition on the links in the few minutes I have left. What I would like to do in closing is to end with a description of two photos taken of a Christian democratic youth organization in the late 60s and early 1970s. And I stay within the country of my youth and whose passport I still carry, West Germany. Here in West Germany, perhaps the most astounding changes occurred within the ranks of the Christian democratic youth organization, the Junge Union. An evocative juxtaposition of photos from their November 1967 National Congress in West Berlin and a 1973 gathering says it much better than ever so many words could possibly tell. And I will try now to share the screen and hopefully get can you see it? Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is a photo of November 1967, the National Conference of the Junge Union, West Berlin. And well, you know, as you can see, the participants sit perfectly choreographed in the fixed rows of a classic auditorium, okay? Neatly trimmed short hair, suits and ties, and the corresponding earnest demeanors of the listeners represented the atmosphere of this annual event. The portrayed individuals, with virtually no exception, come across, to me at any rate, essentially as middle-aged family men. Although I do see one woman in the audience, at least one. Now, a mere 5.5 years later, the room is suddenly filled full of much younger seeming individuals. And let me try to get the second photo on the screen. Whoops. No. Oops. No, that's not it. Let me, okay. We try it again. It's worth it. It's worth it. Bear with me for just a second.
Take your time.
Yeah. Well, that's always what happens. You're trying something which you think is good, and then let me try it this way. Can you see this one? Whoop, whoop.
No.
No, I think I have it. Whoop. Can you see it?
Yes, now
Okay.
we see it.
This is now 5 years later, a mere 5 or even less than 5 years later. Well, you know, I don't need to highlight the differences with the earlier one. It's the same organization, okay, Junge Union, the youth organization. So there's a certain turnover, but okay, a few white shirts and ties even are still visible, but there are the exceptions which confirm the predominance of, I guess, what I would call the various types of leisure wear. Notably, hairstyles are no longer uniform. Short hair by no means the rule. Beards are suddenly cropping up. Sunglasses are worn by delegates in the enclosed conference hall. Delegates are no longer sitting in neat rows with polished dress shoes marking the open space between delegates and speakers, but are instead laid back and nonchalant individuals, some chewing on pencils while listening, others reading newspapers, creating an atmosphere of informality entirely lacking just a few years earlier in West Berlin. And let me stop this thing. And let me just, a final comment is, I've taken this from a book by Mathieu Dubois on the Génération 68, which is a very interesting study. As Mathieu Dubois in his book makes clear, you know, these stylistic changes or the changes in sartorial style and hairstyle were also reflected in a sudden burst of creativity, new designs, and an avalanche of color and political poster production, the organizational press, leaflets, and of course, last but not least, the content of the ideas that we're trying to get across. And so it is with this juxtaposition of two photos taken of the same organization within 5 years' time that I wanted to close. And I thank you for listening, and thank you for bearing with me with my never-ending technical problems here. So thanks.
Not a great problem. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating proposal. I would highlight some of your suggestions, the necessity of a transnational analysis and the new trends on it. The interaction, again, between, in this case, Christian political and social movements as a necessary topic. And third, the perceived and communicated identities. I may sum up something like this. I will come back to this. That is, you are suggesting, I think, things really crucial for an improvement in historiography of Christian democracy. So now we have the third, so thank you again. We have the third speaker now, that is Professor Lukasiewicz. Professor Lukasiewicz is professor at the Lublin Catholic University John Paul II. He has researched essentially on Christian democracy in Eastern Europe, and in particular on Polish emigres in the US and their federalist perspective. He has published different books that have been translated. Some of them has been translated in English. For example, the book about the Third Europe, that is the Polish federalist thought in the United States. Now, Professor Lukasiewicz, please take the floor and speak.
Professor Renato Moro, thank you very much for this kind invitation and this introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, even virtually, and to see all the faces and to interact with you. I should say that I am very inspired by two of my former colleagues and such perspectives of both international approach toward exchange between European Christian democracy and what happened in Latin America. And I will refer to this in a moment, as well as this perspective of research on young Christian Democrats and certain evolution of thinking. Professor Moro mentioned that I started with research on federalist concepts. In real, it was the first perspective which I discovered, important for the emigres of the Cold War from Poland, but important for different types of politics, different types of politicians. So I was able to follow the works by socialists writing on federalism, works by peasant or rather politicians connected with agricultural movements or peasants movements, and also I discovered that a huge part of Christian Democrats in exile were involved in this type of thinking, and it was the first discovery. The second discovery was in 2005 when the first time I met several witnesses involved in such movement, and a combination of this research on thought and personal meeting with the witnesses, it was very important for research generally on Christian democratic exile. I think that I can formulate this topic on which I'm trying to work for years as the Polish Christian democratic exile in a more comparative perspective, because I'm trying to compare them somehow with some other Christian Democrats from Central Europe. It is another story. And Professor Moro suggested that we should talk about results, limits, and some research paths. I will try to adjust to this scheme. And in regard to results, of course, you can find some of them in my book about Third Europe, where is the chapter about Christian Democrats and their attitude toward federalist projects. But I would like to refer also to some other books, especially published by Professor Piotr Kosicki and by Professor Geller, who is present here, where I was trying, inspired by them, to develop this approach toward the immigration, and where you can find some suggestions how it can be treated. So it is not only the history of political thought, it is sometimes the history of, for example, international cooperation. And within the Christian Democratic Union of Central Europe, which emerged in exile, I tried to show how certain patterns they worked out during this exile period, how they tried to transform this cooperation into political practice after 1989, but it didn't happen in real. Yes? So it failed. Conditions which they found in exile were not transferable into the conditions of democratic competition after collapse of communism. It was one thing I wanted to share. Another text which I prepared just recently for Professor Kosicki and Professor Kaiser is about Christian democratic youth still in exile, and about their contacts, about also their international activity, about some very special persons, like my favorite character, Jan Kułakowski, who was young Christian Democrat in the 50s. Then he was one of the leader of Christian democratic trade unions, and after collapse of communism, he came back to Poland, representing Poland to the European communities, and then he was the main negotiator of Polish accession to the European Union. So such perspective can help us to understand what you suggested. Also young persons who became later the older ones. Of course, it is a different perspective than this described by Professor Horn, because simply young Christian Democrats became elder, and no one replaced them. Yes, in exile it was simply impossible, and at the same time the country was closed for Christian democratic ideas, like we knew in the West. So this is one thing. Yes, another political thinking, political activity of young Christian Democrats, and this pattern of international cooperation, I think, can tell us a lot about certain mobility of Christian Democrats, certain, I think, universal message they had for the whole world. But of course, it is on maybe certain idealist level from one side. From the other side, we should remember that behind such activities, very often, we had American policy of the Cold War, which supported such mobility, especially in Latin America, when I can give you some examples of Polish immigrants who went to different countries of Latin America, supporting Christian democratic movement, together with National Committee for Free Europe, financed by American government, as we know. I'm not let's say deepening this direction, because you can find such results in books published or in books which will be published, and I wish very well to the series planned by Civitas. But moving to the second point proposed by Professor Moro, to the limits. I should say that after invitation, my first impression was that we should talk only about COVID. Yes, that we are locked in our rooms without access to the sources and how to cope with the problem. Yes, so for me, the main limit is how to overcome this today. Of course, we have some research done, and I took some photos from the archives today, totally inaccessible for me. Yes, in New York, in Rome, in different places. Yes, we can exchange maybe some materials. But what I would like to emphasize that maybe it is very important direction also for research on Christian democracy to think about digitalization of the materials. What is in progress in many different areas of research, and many archives today are doing this. Just recently, I participated in webinars organized by Professor Victoria Phillips from Columbia University, and she organized even certain group explaining, for example, what we can find in National Archives in London, National Archives in Washington, in Rockefeller Foundation in regard to certain global activity of this foundation. And I'm sure that maybe such direction of overcoming the limits of COVID and our closure, yes, can be a good point for discussion. Of course, I can give you some examples, maybe further in this direction. What archives are available today online, on which we can work during research on Christian democracy. And there, of course, even here are some limits or certain traps. For example, I know that there are digitalized archives of some security services in my part of Europe, in Poland especially. They are digitalized, but they are not open for public. Yes? So you can ask for them if you know that they exist. But without this knowledge, you simply don't know that this direction of research is possible. Also in regard to Christian Democrats, or the contacts, yes, between Christian Democrats in exile and their counterparts in Poland. So this is very shortly in regard to the limits. And if we are thinking about new research paths, also for discussion, I should say that this direction of comparison between Europe and Latin America, it is perfect, very transnational perspective, and very tempting, as well as this international activity of youth, yes, because it is not only the case of young Germans, but for me it is also the case of young immigrants who were in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in many countries during the Cold War, not only from Poland but also from the other countries. So it can give us this additional transnational dimension. But what I would like to add to this perspective, it is also research maybe with more with the framework of political science. Yes, when we are trying to distinguish precisely what is the political identity of Christian Democrats in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, in different countries, and especially after 1999, for me, such a framework proposed by Władysław Zabada or Professor Szczerbiak or Professor Grzema Busse, yes, they tried to analyze what happened with Christian democracy in Central Europe. Yes, they proposed certain framework using the word cleavage. Yes, I work at this a little bit in this last volume edited by Professor Kosicki and Professor Geller, but for me it is certain framework which can give us better understanding of what happened with Christian democracy because of its evolution. And for the discussion, as the last point, I would like to add maybe certain perspective of synthesis, yes, of 20th century Christian democracy. Yes, if we are able to combine all the research we've done, so even without access to additional sources, maybe it is time simply to think about synthesis, yes, about trying to explain what forms of Christian democracy we had, how to distinguish between them, how to describe their evolution, and to ask the question, yes, maybe what is the future of this movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lukasiewicz. Again, some, I think, fundamental suggestion. We are adding more and more perspectives, even geographical perspective, Latin America now, Eastern Europe, and we are adding also, I think, new conceptual issues, that is, international cooperation has been surely one of the fundamental identity points of Christian democracies in their history. And the second problem, the problem of the synthesis. I fully share your view. We need some synthesis about Christian democratic identity as a political family. I will come back to this in a few comments in the end. So thank you very much. Now it's the turn of Professor Hans Kusters doubly welcome. I am the president of Civitas. Professor Kusters has been the former president of Civitas, now is our honorary president. Is professor of political science and contemporary history at the Bonn University. He has worked intensively on history of international, I would say mainly international history of contemporary Germany, especially in the German participation to the to the European economic community and the European economic community in general, and to the German participation to the common Europe, I would say, the integration process of Germany and the lack of a peace treaty and the peace regulation that substituted it, the German unification and the policy of Chancellor Kohl, and then on Konrad Adenauer and the sources for the study of his biography. I invite Professor Kusters to take the floor and to give us his view about our topic.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Moro. I would like to make some remarks to the problems of research today on Christian democracy on the one hand, and perhaps pick up some aspects for further research. I think a lot of hints were made by the other speakers today. I tried to do it in a little bit systematic way. On the one hand, I think we knew a lot of aspects on the ideological positions of the different Christian democratic parties in Europe or as well in Latin America. I think we have no clear separation between what is the element of the Christian democracy on the one hand and conservatism on the other hand. We have some studies on this aspect as well, but I think that is a central point of the understanding of Christian democracy. The second point concerns the question to the economy. In Germany, we have the social market economy concept, but it is not in all other European states a common concept of our understanding as Christian Democrats of economy. And so far, I think there must be some research to do where are the differences on the one hand. A second point, I think, is the role of the Christian democratic parties concerning the institutional or party system aspects. In Germany, we have the concept of the so-called People Party or European People Party. That means it is a catch-all party. But it is discussed from very different views. Is it possible to have such a concept? It is a widespread concept and typical for Christian democratic parties, or is it a special concept, I think. Another point, I think it's very important. We do not know a lot of the question, what is a special element of coalition policy of Christian Democrats? We have some different aspects in Italy or in France or in Germany or in other European or as well Latin America states. But how is it possible to describe what is the element of coalition? We have great coalitions, we have little small coalitions. in parliamentary systems, but it's very important to see how it is possible for the Christian Democrats to bring over their policy, to put it in the governmental policy as well. I think there is a further aspect concerning integration. Integration policy is a center element for Christian Democrats on the one hand, but on the other hand, it has two aspects. The one aspect is the question of the European integration policy, and we knew a lot of as well transnational cooperation. The last studies being published in this period concerns the German policy on European questions. Michael Gehler did a lot of research. Wolfram Kaiser did a lot of research on these as well transnational cooperation. And I think we knew a lot of single aspects. But what we need, I think, is much more question on the development of the national European policy by Christian Democrats. What are the final aim of the Christian Democrats? And I think it is not, of course, in all ways to create a European Union as well. When we have a look to the social integration aspects, that means on the one hand, of course, what about the integration of refugees and displaced persons in Europe? It's in particular a German problem after 1945, but it's as well nowadays a problem how to handle the refugees and what is the special attitude of Christian democratic parties to this central problem we faced in the past and as well in the present. But we have another social aspect. What about the attitude of the Christian Democrats to the question of colonies? In how far is it possible to have some special aspects concerning the Belgians, the French, or the British aspects? How to integrate people from the colonies or from the British Empire in their own social system, in their own society. In so far, it depends a little bit always on the question. We know a lot of general ideological positions of Christian democratic parties, but we do not be very familiar with CD positions in special policy fields. We have in Civitas, I hope next year, for example, a conference on the environmental issue. It is nowadays a central question, but it was as well a central question since the mid-60s of the publications of the Club of Rome, of course. In so far, I think it is necessary to do much more comparative research on Christian democratic parties on these special policy fields. I think a complete other aspect concerns the organizational aspect of the CD parties. Especially in Germany, but in other Western European states, we do not know very well what about the structure of the party, what about the decision-making processes of the CD parties. We know a lot of the influence, the impact of the leaders of the CD's parties. We knew a lot of their international cooperation, but we do not know how are the instrument? How are the structure of this cooperation in this field? I think in this case it is necessary to do a lot of research on the role of special functions in Germany, as well as the role of the Secretary General of a party. How is he able to manage these parties? Let me mention some other aspect. One aspect I think is very important concerning, in general, the question of the CD parties towards a nationalism. We discussed a lot of aspects concerning sovereignty, the right of self-determination. You mentioned political identity. But in one case, we have a lot of desiderata. What about the positions of the CD parties towards nationalism? Their own national position, their own national interest, and how to combine it. And so far, it would be very interesting to have a comparative study on this question, CD and nationalism, I think. In general, it is, I think, a very important point, indeed, general point, but a very important point, the rise and decline or failure of CD parties. I think it's very important to see it how coming up these movements in Latin America, or as well in Europe, in the Western European states, as well as in Eastern European states. But I think it is very important to see in the same way what are the conditions for failure or for not coming up. When I see the development of Christian Democratic Party as perhaps in Poland and other Eastern European states. And so far, I think we should have another look or a new look of an old-fashioned question. Is the question of what about the relationship between the CD parties on the one hand and the Cold War? It is not the old-fashioned question of East-West confrontation, but I think the one point is we should encourage students to have a look on the Russian archives and to ask what is the specific Russian view on CD parties in Western Europe or perhaps as well in Latin America. What about possible developments in neutral states? What's the change? Which function have especially these Christian democratic states? In this case, I think there are two other aspects very important on this old theme, Cold War. The one aspect concerns arm race. CD party and arm race is as well a central question. It depends on the development, of course, of the use of atomic bomb. It is a main key question as a Second Vaticanum. It is a question concerning the development of the transition period in the end 80s and beginning of the 90s, and in a certain way as well today. Then I think another aspect concerns the European, let me say Western European embargo policy towards Eastern Europe. In how far it's, when you may say it or call it the dark side of the European integration policy, with an immense impact, of course. But I think embargo policy by the indeed as well Christian democratic state is a very parties is a very important point which no one has on the scheme. Last point, I think, is as well as a question of support of transition from dictatorship or from dictatorship situations for a short period, transition to democracy. It is not only the studies we have concerning the support of the German CDU towards the development in Spain. Mrs. Orguen worked on this, or in Portugal, but as well the situation in Latin America, which I think is very important, and the rivalry between the Christian democratic parties on the one hand and the socialist or social democratic parties in these countries. And then I come to the last point. We are talking a lot of Latin America, but we have only a few articles and contributions on the question, what is the role of the Christian democratic parties in Africa? It is a very important point to see, on the one hand, the Christianization process in Africa, but what about the building of Christian democratic parties there? Why is it possible to build in some countries, perhaps such groups? Why failed it, or why was it not possible to bring such parties into being, and they have perhaps no political influence in so far? The development CD parties in Africa is you may call it terra incognita, of course. I think it's a whole range of possible questions I try to pick up. In so far, I think we have some limits in doing it, but we should encourage people to put the question. Thank you very much.
Professor Kusters. I took note step by step of what you are suggesting, because it is a treasure of suggestions. We have to discuss many of them inside our scientific committee, because they are probably one of the richest possibility of new topics we may discuss, debate, and add to our list of desiderata, that is, of our possible list of future conferences. I fully agree with all of your points. That is, these are really missing field in which we are missing researchers. Many of them are crucial. I think all of them are crucial. I fully share the point from which you started. That is the problem of the difficult relationship and difficult identity between Christian democratic and conservative parties. This is a crucial point. I think a crucial point not only for the actual political situation, the recent history of Christian democracies, but also from establishing the real common identity of Christian democracy. So thank you all. Thank you, particularly Professor Kusters, for his remarks. I don't know if Professor Giller prefers to be the last of the speakers or the first of the interventions coming from the audience, as he likes. We cannot listen to you. Open your microphone. Michael? We are not able to listen to you.
So can you hear me?
Yes, now. Perfect.
Well, what should I add now? We had very stimulating lectures and a lot of ideas and suggestions. I think it's an ocean of ideas. And the last speaker, Hans-Jürgen Küsters, made it more systematically. And to be honest, I have nothing to add. I think all the other paper givers made it very clear that we have a very big research agenda. I think what is my point of view of that, I think we should define priorities. This is, I think, also a problem of contemporary history research, because the question of relevance is not raised very often. You know, we have a kind of situation of anything goes. And Hans-Jürgen Küsters mentioned the refugee issue. I think this is really a very important point. How the different European or Latin American Christian Democrats judged the issue of migration. It's a global issue. It's not only the refugee crisis of 2015. It's an Italian problem decades before, if you think about Lampedusa. So I think we should also think about the relevance of research projects, because the capacities are limited. We do not have so much students. It was fascinating to hear this talk of this colleague from Paris Sciences Po, so from our colleague Horn, showing what is important, these Catholic social movements. So I think the social question, the question of social inequality, the question of social inequality will be a big issue if we are thinking about the post-pandemic time. This time will come. We do not know when, but this time will come. And I think also what was mentioned about the exile movements. It was our colleague from Lublin, Łukasiewicz. He mentioned this chief negotiator, this Polish chief negotiator organizing the EU entry negotiations of Poland. I think it would be a brilliant idea to make a comparative research study on the different chief negotiators of the different, countries. So the founding members, they had also to negotiate, but also the latecomers, and to look what Hans-Jürgen Küsters mentioned, the ability, the capability to start a coalition policy. For several times, these chief negotiators have to set up a coalition policy. And then we will see that the Christian Democratic Party members or representatives were very flexible. It was Küsters who mentioned the capability to establish coalition policy on the domestic policy level. And if you look to these different constellations and systems, you see Christian democracy was very flexible in order to cooperate or to associate or to have some arrangements. So I think a few of very important topics were made. It's clear everything is important, everything, but we have, I think, the duty to define what are the priorities, the research priorities of Civitas. There are historical, challenges. So from the historiography, that we should look what are the lacunes, what are the missing links, but there is also always the task to have a responsibility of questions, to give answers to questions of today and of our actual situation. So these are a few associations. I was very impressed hearing all the lectures. I made a lot of notices, but I'm not able now to give a second speech because I was not really prepared. Yes. I just recently jumped in and was happy to participate today. But I think it's a question of priority.
Thank you, Michael. It's late, but what you said is fascinating. So I would like to give you my impressions on the situation of research on Christian democracy today. And my impression is summing up many of the things you have said. There is no necessity, I think, to underline the relevance of the Christian democratic family in the political history of the 20th and in the 21st century. European integration, the welfare state, the history of Cold War, the history of supranational cooperation, all you have mentioned are all good reasons to tell us that how important is the history of Christian democracy and how it is necessary to overcome the national borders, the European borders perhaps, and to study it in a worldwide perspective. My impression is that notwithstanding this necessity, it's not the case of many of the members of the Civitas scientific committee, of course, because we are working together on this problem, but this, I think it is a problem, a general problem of studies on Christian democracy. I think that too often these studies are insular, if you may, perhaps parochial would be the fit word given the topic. That is too much formulated inside a national framework. And instead, I think we badly need a comparative perspective. And a comparative perspective means not only to put side by side different national cases, of course, but a comparative perspective means to try to interpret the phenomenon through a comparative lens, if you want, through a comparative view. Cold War history is now internationally based. Global history is coming with limits, of course, but also with many new important contributions. I think that we need a comparative research on Christian democracy, especially because Christian democracy remains a very difficult subject to study. Professor Kusters recalled the problem of the relation with the Conservatives Party. I think this is one fundamental aspect. What kind of political identity, leftist, rightist, and if rightist, what kind center? We need to find some common historical approach to the subject. Christian democracy is difficult to locate in the political spectrum. Christian democracy is difficult to locate because it is multi-phased, it's multiple. We have not a block of movements as in the communist case, for example, in which, of course, there was a strong central leadership. But this is a manifold family with differentiated origins, development, trends, conditions. So this makes difficult the research. Thirdly, Christian democracy is Christian, okay. That is, it's linked to the church. It's linked to the value of Catholic or Christian social doctrine. But at the same time, Christian democracy has been very much secular in its actual political action. And has used widely secular discourse and arguments. So this makes another time difficult to understand the subject. And last, the transformation, that is Cold War and Christian democracy. This is a fundamental aspect, I think, from the point of view of an interpretation. That is, after communism, after the end of communism, probably Christian democratic parties have been one of the parties with the greatest necessity to change. And the metamorphoses that have come from this change, I think they have put some problem of continuity in the history of those parties, groups, trends. That is, we have to analyze periods, to periodize in a certain way the history of Christian democracy, taking into account the changes that has transformed, partially probably, the political identity of every Christian parties. So I think we badly need a comparative approach, and we are missing it. This is something I already said in one of our annual conferences. I am an historian of Catholicism, but Catholicism in the age of fascism essentially. So I am very used with the problem that the scholars about fascism faced, and in a certain way tried to solve. The problem is the multiple identities of fascism. They try to find what they call a generic fascism. This is a sort of minimum common denominator. That is, when Professor Lukasiewicz was talking of a synthesis, I think that one of the efforts scholars about Christian democracy may try to do is to try to individuate this kind of minimum common denominator among different political, Christian and Catholic experiences. And last, Professor Horn suggested, I think in a fascinating way, the problem of the introduction of different cultural, I would say, categories in the history of political phenomenon as Christian democracy. His photographs showed clearly how identities may change. So this is not ideology, this is not organization, this is not simply politics. It is something that has to do with cultural identity, but cultural identity in political experience is fundamental very often. So I think we need a more cultural approach to the history of political parties, and we need more cultural approach, for example, more gender approach to the history of Christian democracy. Not simply in the sense that we need more women history inside the parties, but I think that we need more research on how Christian democracies and Christian social movement have managed, suggested, in some cases promoted gender identities. It is what kind of male, female models with kind of transformations in time. We have to remember that one of the fundamental contribution to the vote for Christian democracy came from women. So I think this is not a minor problem. This are only some suggestions. This is simply my point of view on the situation. And of course, I would like to share this with you and see if it may be the basis for a common work on in the field.
Renato,
Yes.
may I can add a few aspects?
Yes. Sure.
I fully agree what you said. I underline everything. I hope I'm not be misunderstood what I said about priorities and relevance. I would not like to exclude anyone. Also young students who are very ambitious, when they come to my office and they suggest a topic, I do not refuse that. They should go on. But I think as a platform like Civitas or every science foundation, like the political foundations in Germany, they have a certain degree of relevance and priorities when giving money, when supporting students for fellowship. And I would like to differentiate a bit the question of priority and relevance. I think we have research topics which were historical as well as political relevant. These are, topics which are always a topic and which are in a continuity relevant. I take 3 examples. It's the issue, what I mentioned with the chief negotiators, the question of enlargement of the communities and the European Union. Enlargement and deepening is a repeating research topic. It's historical relevant and political relevant. Also what you mentioned with fascism or National Socialism, the dealing with the past, how Christian Democrats dealt with the past is an ongoing topic. It's historical and political. And also the issue what was mentioned by Hans-Jürgen Küsters and also from your side now, the Cold War issue. We have still an East-West divide on the question of migration, for example. So how Christian Democrats coped with this challenge to overcome the East-West divide. In the exile, here Lukasiewicz is our expert. How to deal with this East-West divide. It's from historical point of view very important and also from a political one. But there are also questions of relevance and priorities which were more political than historical. I will give you a few examples. It's very clear what was also mentioned, the environmental policy, the climate change. If you take the 6 topics of the program which was presented by Ursula von der Leyen in last autumn 2019, she made 6 points as points of relevance. We can think about what can we contribute as historians. I will give you an example. I applied for the 4th time for a Jean Monnet chair for the next 3 years. My project proposal was, let us take these 6 points of the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, what she defined, what she formulated as future 6 tasks. Corona was not on the agenda at that time. And I proposed a 3-year program, how these 6 topics, what have these 6 topics historical relevance when going back also to the time before the European communities. So, and I will give you a last example. I was very inspired by the paper, by the lecture given by De Giuseppe, with this relevance on relations on the Latin Christian democracy. I think we have to be fully aware that the international system changed totally after 1989, and how Christian Democrats perceived this change of the international framework, and how Christian Democrats in the different countries, in the different continents, in Latin America and Europe, Western and Central and Eastern Europe, how they contributed to the debate about a new world order. A new world order. I think it's a central topic with high relevance, very political, maybe a bit more political than historical. But I think we should define priorities and relevance of ongoing topics,
Yes.
which are relevant from the very beginning of maybe the time after 45, and of questions of relevance on priority, more political, more actual than historical, but also relevant, like the question of social inequality. Full stop. Thanks again.
No, thank you. I fully agree with the distinction.
May I add only one sentence?
Hans.
I fully agree what Michael Gehler told us. I think it is very important to have such a priorities. Much is nice to have, but it's of course of a certain relevance. But some other aspects are very important to bring forward the thinking and the acknowledges on Christian democracy. I would only add one aspect concerning the archives. Mr. Lukaczewicz told us how important it is that archives have some materials digitalized, are able to present it to the audience in the web, of course. I think a lot of aspects are very important, but they need a lot of materials being available. And insofar, I would prefer that we are Civitas. We try to identify a lot of aspects Michael Gehler told us, and we combine it with the possibilities of sources we have available or can be made available to these topics. Otherwise, it is very important. It's very difficult to do some further research on these topics.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very late, but I think there is a clear possibility to invite the audience to intervene with comments, suggestions, questions to the speakers. I ask if somebody has this intention to send me a message through the chat, so I will be able to see it as a sort of raised hand. I think we have to wait some minute to give time to people in case to make some kind of intervention.
I see the end of Michael Brochard.
You see it because I...
Yeah.
Oh, Michael.
Yeah, I would just like to support what just has been said by Professor Küsters when it comes to the combination of the digitalization project on the one hand, and the question about what are our relevance, what are our priorities, because it has to be said that to digitalize material is a very time-consuming, very money-consuming, very problematic task. And if we want to make the access to this material possible, it is very important that we have clear priorities, because it takes years to digitalize the material. I think this has to be, because there's the common misunderstanding that we can reach, let's say, 50, 60, 70% easily, but that's not possible. I mean, if you look at the National Archive in Germany, the Bundesarchiv, their digitalization quote is below 2%. And that's not because of the fact that they are not putting enough emphasis on that, but it's very, very time consuming. So this is what I would like to support. And the second point I would like to support is what has been said by you, Renato. I think that the comparative approach is extremely important, especially when it comes to the rise and decline of the parties. And in that case, I would specify that especially the comparative approach between the social democratic movements and the Christian democratic movements is very important. And also the interactions between them. I think it was very fascinating what Mr. Horn presented to us, to show that there are interactions and that there have been social movements. Movements also, I would also include here the Greens, which had impact on the way that the Christian democratic parties in Europe acted and interacted also with them. So I would think that especially not only the comparative approach, but the interaction between the bigger movements is a very, very important point. And the third point I would like to mention is more a question, and that question goes to Massimo de Giuseppe. In my capacity being the General Secretary of Civitas, forgive me for asking a very utilitaristic question. And that question is, if we want to win an institution, personality, institute in Latin America for joining Civitas and our work, so your knowledge, I would like to ask what institute, what personality, which institution we should ask to join us. Are there institutions besides those ones that we already know, where you would recommend to ask them, to address them, and to kind of drag them into our community? Because I think what you raised is very, very important. We are still very much concentrated on Europe, also on the Anglo-Saxon echelons, but not enough on the Latin American echelons. So I would love to also address those institutions and to, as I said, drag them into our community.
Thank you, Michael. I fully agree. Also the comparative approach, not only at international level, but between great mass political movements, because you cannot study one movement without comparison with the others, of course. I fully agree. Precious, thank you. I think we have taken too much time, giving not enough time to the audience today, but I think this has been a fascinating discussion and fundamental from the point of view of the president of this network devoted to the study and research on Christian democracy, of course. I know if there are some more interventions. Massimo?
So thanks for the very interesting suggestions. I don't want to repeat, but it was really fascinating, as Renato just said. Three very, very short answers and an answer to Michael. I will start from the archives. The archives, I totally agree with Kusters and the idea. We have to be realistic. For example, would be wonderful for Latin America see the Cuban archives, because there is a really important use of some Catholic myths. Camilo Torres, for example, killed in Colombia, that was transformed in a Marxist myth by Fidel, and but is impossible to visit Cuban archives seriously, or not totally impossible, but almost impossible. But we can, for example, find a lot of Cuban documentation in Fondazione Lelio Basso in Roma through the human rights permanent committee that were organized by Lelio Basso, that involved also many Catholics and members of Christian democratic parties. So, for example, Gerd Reiner was talking about Christian for Socialism, and there is all the Giulio Girardi documentation about this movement inside the Lelio Basso archive. So we can find archives that can help in a reconstruction. Also trying to find documents outside of the classic Catholic archives that we are used to to study for democratic Christian issues. Second question, I think the theme of the exile, I think it's a real priority. That's really important. And we have to remember that we can find around the exile a lot of this idea of mixing that is part of the necessity of an integral comparative history, as Renato said. A very short example, the archive, the experience of the exile of the Vicaria Apostolica, the Chilean apostolic bishop organization that try to help people, not only Catholic people, also members of MIR, Marxist, members of Izquierda Cristiana to go to Europe. In many of these cases, you find the presence of political actors. For example, Gilberto Bonalumi, a member of Young Democratic Christian, that was central in this process. You can find members of the clergy, and you can find lay people. So it's very complex, but at the same time interesting to see these borders crossed that can give you a very complex idea of this theme of the exile around the Christian Democratic Party studies. And for another example, when you talk about the presence of Catholics exiles in Italy, you have a lot of high society or political member exiled in Italy that came through the Democratic Christian Party. But if you study the Salvadorian exile, for example, and Milan is the first city in Europe for the presence of Salvadorian people, is an exile that started with with Bishop Martini, and you have the presence of little members of Democratic Christian Party, Milan Democratic Christian Party, involved with Human Rights Association that worked with the Jesuits to bring people from poor areas of Salvador. So this kind of exile is not the high illustrated exile of Chile, but is a poor rural exile that came to Milan. So there are a lot of different issues that can be studied. Third element, Cold War. All you know that in '69, the report, Rockefeller report to the Nixon administration about the danger for US in Latin America was very directed to the big danger of the politicization of the Catholics. The first danger was Cuba, obviously, and the Focismo. The second danger was Social Democrats. But the third danger, and in the vision of Rockefeller, the most dangerous danger for the US policy was this process of politicization of the Catholics inside and outside the Democratic Christian Party. That's another very important thing that should be studied together with the human rights violation, together with the Condor Plan experience, together with a lot of other things in a comparative and integral way. A lot of members of Christian movements and Christian Party, Democratic Party, were involved in the repression in the South America and in Central America. So that's another big issue around Cold War, with all the peculiar things of the Latin American Cold War that sometimes has a different periodization and the start and the end respect of the war, the global Cold War. And about the question of groups of Michael, there are a lot of possibilities in Latin America outside of the classic group of like Patricio Aylwin Foundation and this kind of Rafael Caldera, etc., etc. For example, in Chile, there is a lot of documentation interesting inside the Álvaro Hurtado Foundation. That it's a Jesuit originally foundation, but could be in some way contact and put in the view of a collaboration. In other parts in Central America, we have, for example, all the documentation of the Human Rights Commission of the Bishop, founded by Bishop Romero, but then saved by Bishop Rivera y Damas. That is Roberto Cuellar, the old director, could be a very interesting interlocutor. In Mexico, we have a very strange situation in Mexico respect of the Catholic archives, but that's another interesting thing. In many Latin American countries, the digitalization of the historical archive is better than in Europe. In Mexico, all the part between the 34 for the first decades of 20th century of the Archbishop archive are totally digitalized. And this is common in a lot of different archives in Latin America. It's something surprising some way, but in the Brazilian archives are not so bad in this way. I think Italy, Archivio Centrale dello Stato, is one of the poorest situation, or the international relation Italian archive is in a terrible situation. But in Latin America, we can have some interesting resources in the digital field. So I think we could improve a lot of relation network connections in a creative way.
Thank you, Massimo, very much. We will count on you in the future, sure. No, I don't know if there is anybody who wants to add something. If not,
can I say one last thing about? I was really interested in the list of big issues, and another issues near nationalism could be in Latin America the relation, but also in Europe, the relation with the idea of race. I remember a lot of complex debate in Latin American Christian democratic groups during the 30s and the 40s about the idea of Hispanidad, limpieza de sangre, the pure blood of Spaniard against the mestizo nationalism of Mexican state, or in other cases. So the theme of the race that also was very important in the action of UNESCO, Vittorino Veronese, and other democratic Christian, is something really important for me in the rebuilding of the identity of Democratic Christian Party.
Okay, thank you again. So if there is no further comment or intervention, I have only to thank all the speakers for their wonderful contribution. For me, it was a fascinating evening. I learned many things, and I received so many suggestions for open fields and new perspectives that think that the scientific committee of Civitas will have many time to spend on them and in order to debate them and try to imagine, according to what Miguel Gale suggested, a list of priorities according to which to continue our work. So thank you for all the people who were present. I hope that everybody was fascinated, and as I was, and have a good evening, have a good night, and I hope to meet you again tomorrow at the same time with the presentation of the Academy and Piotr Korsicki's keynote speech on why study Christian democracy. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you for your comments. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.